briefing room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado fell silent when she walked in. Not the respectful kind of silence that greets a commanding officer, but the thick, uncomfortable quiet that follows a punchline nobody wanted to hear out loud. Lieutenant Vera Kozak moved through it like water, her boots making no sound on the polished floor, her eyes fixed on the podium where the SEAL instructor stood waiting. She'd learned long ago that silence was just another kind of noise, and noise could be ignored. What couldn't be ignored was the way the 5 Marine instructors in the back row shifted in their seats, their smirks visible even from across the room. They'd flown in from Camp Pendleton specifically for this joint evaluation exercise, and their reputation preceded them like a weather system. Hard, uncompromising, legendary for breaking candidates who thought they had what it took. The lead instructor, a boulder of a man named Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hendricks, leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been proven wrong. His eyes tracked Kozak as she took her seat in the front row, alone, a full 3 rows separating her from the nearest SEAL candidate. She could feel his assessment like hands on her shoulders, weighing, measuring, finding her wanting before she'd even opened her mouth. The exercise parameters were simple in theory, brutal in execution. 5 days in the Mojave Desert, no support, no extraction unless you rang the bell, urban warfare simulation, hostage rescue, combat medicine, and hand-to-hand combat scenarios designed by the Marines themselves. Every SEAL candidate would face the same gauntlet, but Kozak would go first. The instructor at the podium, Commander Rachel Voss, didn't look at her when she explained this. Nobody did. It was as if they'd already written the outcome, already composed the after-action report that would document her failure. Hendricks had made it clear in the hallway before the briefing, his voice carrying just far enough. "Try not to cry, doll. We'll have a medic standing by when you ring out." His Marines had laughed, not loudly, just enough. Kozak's file sat on Voss's desk, thin for someone who'd spent 8 years in the Navy. Fighter pilot. FA-18 Super Hornet, 3 deployments, shot down over Syria, evaded capture for 6 days before exfiltration. The kind of resume that should have commanded respect but somehow didn't. Maybe it was because she'd transferred from aviation to special warfare. Maybe it was because she'd never fit the mold they expected. Maybe it was simply because she was Vera Kozak, and that had always been enough to make certain men nervous. She didn't know. Didn't particularly care. What mattered was the desert waiting outside, and the 5 Marines who thought they already knew how this would end. The first light of dawn painted the Mojave in shades of rust and gold, the kind of beauty that existed specifically to remind human beings how small they were. Kozak stood at the drop-off point, her gear pack settled against her spine with the familiar weight of purpose, watching the helicopter that had brought her dissolve into the morning sky. The wash from its rotors kicked up sand that stung her exposed skin, but she didn't turn away. She watched until it became a black dot, then nothing, then just the memory of sound. Then she was alone with the desert and the radio clipped to her vest and the knowledge that somewhere out there, Hendricks and his Marines were already moving into position. They had 4 hours head start. They knew the terrain. They'd set the scenarios themselves, designed every trap and ambush point with the specific goal of breaking her before lunch. The radio crackled once, Voss's voice cutting through the static. "Razor, you are cleared hot. Exercise is live." Razor. The call sign had followed her from her fighter pilot days, earned not for aggression but for precision. For the way she could thread a needle at Mach 1.2 could put ordnance on target in conditions that grounded everyone else. Her squadron commander had said she flew like a surgeon worked, every movement deliberate, every decision clean. She'd worn the name like armor ever since. Kozak keyed her radio once to acknowledge, then started walking. The first objective was 12 miles northeast, an abandoned mining facility where a simulated hostage situation waited. Intelligence package said 3 hostiles, 1 civilian, unknown weapons. The kind of scenario that looked straightforward on paper and became chaos the moment you breached the door. She moved through the desert like she'd moved through the briefing room, efficiently and without waste, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for the things that didn't belong. A reflection where there shouldn't be one. A shadow angled wrong for the sun. The Marines would be watching. She was certain of it. Hendricks wasn't the type to sit back and wait for her to reach the objectives. He'd want to test her early, see how she reacted to pressure, see if she'd break before the real work even started. The thought made her smile, a quick expression that came and went like heat lightning. Let them watch. Let them think they knew what was coming. 3 hours into the march, she found the first sign. Boot prints in the sand, deliberately placed where she'd see them, leading off toward a cluster of rocks that offered perfect overwatch of her route. An amateur would have avoided them. A paranoid operator would have called in the contact, requested guidance. Kazak kept walking, but her hand drifted to the M4 carbine slung across her chest, and her breathing shifted into the pattern she'd learned in survival school. Slow, measured, ready. The mining facility rose from the desert like a monument to abandoned ambition, all rust-eaten metal and sun-bleached wood, its windows empty as eye sockets. Kazak approached from the south, using a dry wash for concealment, her movements now slow enough that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The radio had been silent for hours. No updates, no guidance. Just her and the objective and the certainty that Hendricks had people inside, waiting to see what she'd do. The standard approach would be to establish a perimeter, identify entry points, clear room by room with methodical precision. But standard approaches came from manuals written by people who'd never had to improvise at 30,000 feet with one engine flaming out and the other running rough. Kazak had learned to read situations the way some people read books, looking for the story beneath the words, the truth hidden in the margins. She spent 20 minutes watching the building, noting the places where dust had been disturbed, where shadows moved wrong, where the silence felt too complete. Then she bypassed the main entrance entirely and headed for the ventilation shaft on the north side, the one that looked too small to be useful, too awkward to be tactical. It was perfect. Inside the facility, Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks checked his watch and frowned. 45 minutes since Kazak should have arrived. His Marines were positioned throughout the building, role players in place, weapons loaded with simunition rounds that would hurt like hell but wouldn't kill. Everything was ready. Except the target hadn't shown. Anyone got eyes on her, he muttered into his radio, keeping his voice low even though there was no one to hear. The responses came back negative. Staff Sergeant Nicole Reeves, positioned on the second floor with a clear view of the southern approach, reported nothing. Corporal James Chen on the eastern perimeter had seen only dust devils and heat shimmer. Lance Corporal Deshaun Porter, playing the hostage in the central room, was getting bored. Sergeant First Class Anton Volkov, Hendricks's second-in-command and closest friend, suggested maybe she'd quit. Maybe the desert had been enough. Maybe they'd overestimated her entirely. Hendricks didn't respond because he didn't believe it, not really, but he couldn't explain why. There was something about the way Kazak had moved through that briefing room, something about the way she'd absorbed his insult without reaction, that nagged at him like a stone in his boot. Then the lights went out. Every single one, simultaneously, plunging the facility into darkness cut only by the thin streams of sunlight through the broken windows. Hendricks's training kicked in immediately, his rifle coming up, his body moving to the nearest cover. His radio burst to life with confused chatter from his Marines, everyone talking over everyone else, trying to understand what had happened. In the chaos, nobody heard the ventilation shaft cover being carefully, silently, replaced. Nobody noticed the slight change in air pressure. Nobody saw Vera Kazak drop into the hallway behind Reeves's position, her movements as economical as breath. What followed would be discussed in quiet corners of Camp Pendleton for years afterward, the kind of story that grew in the telling but never quite captured the reality. Kazak cleared the building in 7 minutes. She used the darkness she'd created by cutting the main power line, used her night vision optic to move through the facility like smoke. Reeves never saw her coming, just felt the tap on her shoulder and heard the quiet words, "You're dead, Staff Sergeant." Chen managed to get his rifle up before the simunition round caught him center mass, the impact hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Volkov, to his credit, actually got a shot off, but Kazak had already moved and his round hit nothing but wall. She found Porter in the central room, still zip-tied to the chair where they'd placed him, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Stay quiet," she told him, cutting his bonds with a tactical knife that appeared from nowhere. "I'm your ride home." Then she was moving again, heading for the main entrance where Hendricks waited, his rifle trained on the darkness, his mind racing through possibilities. He'd heard the shots, heard the brief radio exchanges before his Marines stopped responding, knew with absolute certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his perfect scenario. When Kazak emerged from the shadows with Porter behind her, when she cleared the doorway and neutralized Hendricks with 2 center-mass shots before he could fully process what he was seeing, the only sound was his own grunt of pain and surprise. Then her voice, calm as Sunday morning. "Building secure. 1 hostile eliminated, 4 neutralized, 1 civilian recovered. Time elapsed, 7 minutes 43 seconds. The sun was directly overhead when Kazak called in the successful completion of the first objective, the heat now so intense that the air itself seemed to shimmer with violence. Hendricks and his Marines stood in the shade of the facility's overhang, nursing their simunition welts and their damaged pride. Volkov kept touching his chest where Kazak's rounds had hit, as if he could somehow reverse engineer what had happened from the ache alone. Reeves hadn't said a word since being eliminated, her jaw set in a line that could have cut glass. Chen was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "How did you cut the power?" Kazak didn't look up from her map, her finger tracing the route to the next objective. "Exterior junction box, northwest corner, took maybe 30 seconds. We checked the perimeter. Not carefully enough." It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. Hendricks found himself studying her with new eyes, seeing past the initial assessment he'd made in the briefing room. She moved like someone who'd spent time in places where mistakes cost more than pride. Her hands, when she folded the map, were scarred in ways that suggested she'd learned about fire the hard way. The radio clipped to her vest was set to frequency hop automatically, a pilot's paranoia about being tracked. Everything about her spoke to a kind of professionalism that couldn't be taught, only earned. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Kazak finally looked up, her eyes finding his across the 10 feet of desert that separated them. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Syria, 2019. Spent 6 days behind enemy lines after my Super Hornet took a MANPADS to the port engine. Learned real quick that the loudest person in the room is usually the first one killed." She shouldered her pack and checked her weapon with the kind of casual competence that made it look like meditation. "Second objective is 17 miles northwest. Hostage rescue, elevated position, limited approach vectors. I'm guessing you've got snipers positioned on the high ground, crossfire lanes established, the whole 9 yards. Hendricks said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Kazak nodded once, as if filing the information away in whatever mental catalog she maintained. "Sunrise tomorrow. I'll see you there." Then she was walking, heading northwest into the desert that stretched away like an ocean of sand and stone, leaving the 5 Marines to stare after her with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to something approaching awe. Porter, rubbing feeling back into his wrists, watched her until she disappeared into the heat shimmer. "She didn't have to cut me loose," he said quietly. "Scenario didn't require civilian extraction." Hendricks knew. The parameters had allowed for either extraction or marking the civilian's position for later recovery. Kazak had chosen the harder path, the one that exposed her to more risk, because it was the right call, because she was treating this like a real operation, with real stakes and real people depending on her decisions. He touched his chest where her rounds had hit, feeling the tender bruise already forming. "Try not to cry, doll." His own words echoed back at him now with the weight of stupidity, the kind of casual cruelty that felt clever right up until it didn't. "Gear up," he told his Marines, his voice rougher than intended. "We've got 16 hours to prep the next scenario." Nobody asked if they should make it harder. They were all thinking the same thing. Night in the Mojave came like a curtain falling, the temperature plummeting 40 degrees in the space of an hour, the sky opening up to reveal stars in quantities that city dwellers forgot existed. Kazak made camp in a shallow depression between two rock formations, her shelter half rigged to block the wind, her sleeping bag rated for temperatures well below what the desert would throw at her. She ate an MRE without tasting it, drank water in measured amounts, and let her body rest while her mind continued to work through tomorrow's scenarios. The second objective was classic special operations material. Hostage in an elevated structure, multiple hostiles, complex terrain that favored defenders. Hendricks would have positioned his snipers to cover every approach, would have established overlapping fields of fire, would have made it mathematically impossible to reach the target without being detected. The smart play would be to wait for darkness, use the night as concealment, methodically eliminate the snipers before moving on the structure itself. But Hendricks knew that. He'd be expecting it. Which meant she needed to do something he wasn't expecting, something that violated the conventional wisdom so completely that it wouldn't even register as a possibility until it was too late. She smiled in the darkness, remembering her flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola, a weathered commander named Vasquez who'd flown F-14s in the First Gulf War. He told her once that the difference between good pilots and great ones wasn't skill or courage, it was imagination. The ability to see solutions that didn't exist in the manual, to thread needles that everyone else assumed were solid walls. "You've got that quality, Kazak," he'd said, watching her execute a landing approach in conditions that had grounded half the squadron. "Question is whether you're smart enough to know when to use it and when to follow the rules." She'd spent 8 years learning to answer that question. Tomorrow, in the daylight that everyone assumed made stealth impossible, she'd prove she'd learned the lesson. Dawn found her 5 miles from the objective, moving fast through terrain that offered almost no concealment, her body low and her breathing controlled despite the pace. She'd left most of her gear cached in a shallow cave, carrying only her rifle, her radio, 2 smoke grenades, and the absolute certainty that what she was about to attempt was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. The elevated structure was an old water tower, its metal frame rising from the desert floor like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. Perfect for observation, defensible with clear lines of sight in every direction. Kazak could see 3 snipers through her rifle optic, positioned exactly where she'd expected them. Hendricks himself would be inside the tower with the hostage, playing the role of primary hostile, confident in the security his Marines provided. The conventional approach would take hours. Careful stalking through the rocks, eliminating each sniper position silently, gradually collapsing the security perimeter until she could make her move. By the time she reached the tower, the sun would be setting again, and Hendricks would have spent the entire day watching her predictable, professional, utterly unremarkable approach. Instead, Kazak popped smoke. Both canisters simultaneously, thrown with the accuracy of someone who'd spent years calculating ballistic trajectories in her head. Orange and purple clouds billowed into the morning air, thick and fast spreading, creating a wall of obscured vision between her position and the tower. Before the smoke had fully deployed, she was sprinting. The snipers' reactions were textbook perfect. They called it in immediately, their voices crisp and professional on the radio, establishing fields of fire despite the obscured vision, waiting for her to emerge from the smoke in a position they could engage. What they didn't expect was for her to never emerge at all. Kazak hit the smoke at a full run and kept going, using the colored clouds as a moving curtain, staying in the thickest part where visibility dropped to arm's length. The snipers tracked her movement by sound and intuition, their crosshairs searching for a target that refused to materialize. By the time the smoke began to thin, she was already past their perimeter, already inside the range where their long guns became liabilities instead of assets, already moving up the water tower's ladder with the casual speed of someone who'd climbed into aircraft cockpits 1,000 times before. Hendricks saw her coming with maybe 5 seconds warning, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes were telling him. Nobody approached in daylight. Nobody used smoke like a sprinter used starting blocks. Nobody climbed exposed ladders in full view of sniper positions and somehow made it work. He brought his rifle up, trying to acquire a target through the platform's metal grating, but Kazak was already there, already moving through the small access hatch, already inside his decision loop. The simunition rounds she put in his chest were almost gentle by comparison to what she'd done to his assumptions. "Building secure," she said into her radio, her breathing barely elevated. "One hostile eliminated. Hostage recovered. Time elapsed, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Outside, the smoke drifted away on the desert wind, and the snipers started the long climb down from their positions, their faces showing the kind of confusion that comes from having your entire tactical framework invalidated in the space of a single engagement. Commander Voss received the second objective report in her air-conditioned command trailer at Coronado, reading it twice to make sure she hadn't missed something. 4 minutes. Daylight approach. Direct assault on a fortified position with established sniper coverage. 0 casualties, full objective completion, hostile force neutralized. She pulled up the video feed from the tower's surveillance system, watched Kazak's smoke deployment, watched her sprint through the colored clouds like a bullet, watched her climb the ladder with the kind of economy of movement that suggested this wasn't courage. It was just Tuesday. Then she picked up her phone and called the base commander, a quiet captain named Malcolm Rhodes who'd been in special operations for 20 years and had seen everything twice. "Sir, I think we might want to put more observers on the remaining scenarios. Lieutenant Kazak is," she paused, searching for the right word, "unusual." Rhodes had already been watching the feeds, had already seen what Hendricks's carefully constructed evaluation was becoming. "What's the betting pool up to?" "Last I heard, $300. Most people had her ringing out after the first objective. Some of the optimists gave her until day 3. Rhodes made a non-committal sound. "What's your read, Commander?" Voss looked at the screen, where Kazak was descending the water tower with the role-player hostage in tow, her movements controlled despite the fatigue that had to be setting in. 2 objectives down, 3 to go, and she just invalidated every tactical assumption Hendricks had built his reputation on. "I think," Voss said carefully, "that we're going to need to adjust our evaluation criteria. This isn't about whether she can complete the course. It's about whether the course can actually test her." The third objective was supposed to be the breaking point. Combat medicine under fire, with simulated casualties, hostile pressure, and time constraints that made success mathematically improbable. Hendricks had designed it himself, using lessons from real-world operations, incorporating the kind of stress that separated operators who could perform from operators who could perform while everything went to hell. The scenario was simple: 3 wounded Marines in a hot landing zone, incoming fire from multiple directions, limited medical supplies, and a 30-minute window before simulated reinforcements arrived. The catch was that the wounds were severe enough to require immediate intervention, scattered widely enough that treating one meant temporarily abandoning the others, and the incoming fire was intense enough that staying in the open for more than a few seconds was tactically suicidal. Hendricks had run the scenario twice with his own Marines, both times resulting in at least 1 simulated fatality and multiple failures of medical protocol. He wasn't expecting Kazak to succeed. He was expecting her to demonstrate grace under pressure, to make difficult triage decisions, to show she could handle the reality that special operations sometimes meant choosing who lived and who didn't. What he got instead was a masterclass in creative problem-solving that would later be added to SEAL training curricula as an example of unconventional thinking. Kazak took one look at the scenario, assessed the 3 casualty positions and the hostile fire lanes, and immediately called in artillery. Simulated artillery, using smoke rounds, on positions she designated with laser designators borrowed from the range control officer. The incoming fire stopped within 90 seconds as the role-player hostiles were forced to displace or be eliminated by the smoke strikes. With the battlefield suddenly quiet, she triaged all 3 casualties simultaneously, using her radio to walk the least injured Marine through self-aid procedures while she worked on the most critical. Time elapsed, 19 minutes. All 3 casualties stable. 0 fatalities. Hendricks stood in the observation post, watching through binoculars, and felt something shift in his chest that might have been respect, or might have been the first whisper of understanding that he'd badly miscalculated this entire evaluation. That night, around a fire that existed only because Voss authorized it after seeing the day's footage, Hendricks and his Marines sat in unusual silence. Reeves was the first to speak, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was still processing everything. She called in artillery on a medical scenario. That's not even in the doctrinal framework. Doctrinal framework assumes you're working within established parameters, Volkov said quietly. She's rewriting the parameters as she goes. Chen shook his head, not in disagreement but in something approaching wonder. Did you see how she moved during the tower assault? I've seen fast-rope insertions with more caution. She just sprinted through our entire security perimeter like it wasn't there. Porter, who'd been quiet most of the night, finally added his thoughts. In the first scenario, when she cut me loose, she checked my pulse and pupils before cutting the zip ties. Wasn't part of the role-play requirement. She just did it because that's what you do when you're extracting someone who might be injured. That's not someone going through the motions. That's someone who treats every rep like it's real. Hendricks stared into the fire, remembering the way Kazak had looked at him in that briefing room, the way she'd absorbed his insult without flinching. Try not to cry, doll. The words felt like lead in his memory now, heavy and poisonous and impossible to take back. He'd made an assumption based on nothing but his own bias, had constructed an entire evaluation designed to prove a conclusion he'd already reached. And Kazak, in 3 objectives, had systematically dismantled every piece of that construction with the same precision she'd probably used to put ordnance on target from 30,000 feet. Tomorrow's scenario is urban warfare, he said finally. Close quarters battle, building clearance, multiple hostile positions. We designed it to be impossible to complete without taking casualties. Reeves looked at him across the fire, her expression unreadable. You think she'll find a way? Hendricks didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and kicked sand over the fire, watching the embers die in the darkness. I think we're going to find out what happens when someone doesn't know something is impossible. The urban warfare scenario was built in a mock city 3 miles from the main training area. Concrete buildings and empty streets designed to replicate Middle Eastern urban environments. Hendricks had positioned his Marines in overlapping defensive positions, had established kill zones and choke points, had made the tactical situation as close to real combat as training conditions allowed. The objective was straightforward: clear 6 buildings, neutralize all hostiles, secure the area for follow-on forces. Standard SEAL house clearing methodology would take hours and would definitely result in at least 1 casualty, probably more. Kazak stood at the entry point as the sun climbed toward noon, studying the mock city through her rifle optic, her expression thoughtful. She could see the obvious positions, the windows where Hendricks's Marines waited with their simunition weapons, the intersections that would turn into fatal funnels the moment she stepped into the street. A direct assault was suicide. A methodical building-by-building clear would take until nightfall and would expose her to fire from multiple directions. So she burned it down. Not literally, but close enough. She'd spotted the propane tanks used for tactical training scenarios, the smoke generators for simulated IEDs, the Thunderflash grenades in the scenario controller's supply cache. What followed was less a building clearance and more a sustained artillery barrage, with Kazak using every diversionary tool at her disposal to create chaos so complete that Hendricks's carefully positioned Marines couldn't establish target acquisition. Smoke everywhere. Thunderflashes going off in sequence, creating the acoustic signature of sustained combat. Propane tanks ignited at a distance, creating fireballs that forced evacuation of several positions. And through it all, Kazakh moved like wind through grass, clearing rooms while everyone was looking the other way, neutralizing hostiles while they were still trying to figure out where the next explosion would come from. She finished in 47 minutes. All buildings cleared. All hostiles neutralized. 0 casualties. When Hendricks emerged from his position, coughing from the smoke, his uniform covered in concrete dust from a thunderflash that had detonated closer than comfortable, he found Kazakh sitting on the hood of a burned-out vehicle prop, drinking water and looking entirely too composed for someone who just set half the training area on fire. That, he said when he could speak, was not in the approved scenario parameters. Kazakh's smile was brief. Neither was Syrian airspace when my Super Hornet went down. Improvise, adapt, overcome, right. She slid off the hood and collected her gear. What's the fifth objective, Gunnery Sergeant? Or are we done pretending this is an actual evaluation? The words hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, impossible to ignore, cutting through every pretense with the precision of a scalpel. Hendricks felt his Marines watching him, felt the weight of the question underneath Kazakh's question. She wasn't asking about the next scenario. She was asking if he was ready to admit what they both knew. This had never been about evaluating her capabilities. It had been about proving she didn't belong, about confirming his assumptions, about making sure the punchline landed the way he'd written it. He could feel the moment crystallizing, could feel the choice presenting itself with unusual clarity. He could continue the evaluation, run her through the fifth scenario, maintain the fiction that this was all legitimate training. Or he could be honest, could acknowledge that she'd already proven everything that needed proving, that she'd taken his carefully constructed tests and turned them into demonstrations of exactly why she deserved to be here. Commander Voss's voice crackled through his radio before he could answer. All stations, this is actual. Exercise is suspended. Lieutenant Kazakh, you are to return to base for debrief. Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks, your team is released from scenario support. Good work, everyone. The radio went dead. Hendricks looked at Kazakh, saw something in her eyes that might have been disappointment or might have been relief, and found himself speaking before thinking. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, I was wrong. In the briefing room, about you, Kazakh's expression didn't change. You were wrong about a lot of things, Gunnery Sergeant. That was just the most obvious. She shouldered her pack and started walking, heading back toward Coronado and whatever came next, leaving Hendricks and his Marines to stand in the smoke and dust of their dismantled assumptions. The debrief took place in Commander Voss's office, a space that smelled of coffee and old paperwork and the accumulated weight of difficult decisions. Kazakh sat in the chair across from Voss's desk, her uniform dusty but her spine straight, waiting with the patience of someone who'd spent 6 days evading capture in hostile territory. Voss studied her for a long moment, then slid a file across the desk. That's your after-action report from Syria. The official one, not the classified version. I read it last night after watching your performance today. Kazakh didn't reach for the file. She knew what was in it. Knew every detail of those 6 days, every decision that had kept her alive and moving, every close call that had come down to inches and seconds and luck that felt more like borrowed time. The pilot who pulled you out, Voss continued, Captain Michael Zhao. He said you walked 15 miles with a fractured ankle, crossed 2 enemy checkpoints using a dead soldier's uniform, and navigated to the extraction point using nothing but a compass you made from a magnetized needle and a bowl of water. He said when they found you, you were providing first aid to a civilian child who'd been caught in crossfire, even though it meant exposing your position. Kazakh's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Child was 8 years old, shrapnel wounds, wasn't going to leave her. That's why you transferred to special warfare, isn't it? Because sitting in a cockpit 30,000 feet up stopped feeling close enough to the people who needed help. It wasn't a question, but Kazakh answered anyway. I got tired of dropping bombs and flying home, wanted to be on the ground where the consequences were real. Voss nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks is a good Marine, one of the best I've worked with. but he made an assumption about you based on incomplete information and personal bias. What he put you through these last 4 days, it wasn't professional, it wasn't fair, and it wasn't what you deserved. Doesn't matter, Kozak said quietly. I proved what needed proving. Did you? Voss leaned forward, her expression intent. Because from where I'm sitting, you proved something entirely different. You proved that the evaluation framework we use is inadequate for assessing operators like you. You proved that our tactical doctrines have blind spots large enough to drive trucks through. You proved that some of our best instructors still have biases they need to work on. She paused. What you didn't prove is that you needed to prove anything at all. Your record spoke for itself. We should have listened. The formal evaluation concluded with Kozak being certified for SEAL operations, but the real conclusion came 3 days later, at a bar in Coronado where operators went to decompress and tell stories that would never make it into official reports. Hendricks found her there, sitting alone at the end of the bar, nursing a beer and watching the sunset through the window with the kind of distant focus that suggested her mind was somewhere else entirely. He almost turned around and left. But Volkov had cornered him that morning, had said in his quiet way that some things needed to be addressed head-on, and Volkov was usually right about these things. So Hendricks walked to the bar and took the stool next to Kozak, ordered a beer he didn't particularly want, and sat in uncomfortable silence while he tried to figure out how to begin. Kozak spoke first. If you're here to apologize again, don't bother. Apologies without changed behavior are just words. Her voice was calm, factual, without heat or malice. Hendricks found that somehow worse than anger would have been. Then I'm here to tell you that I'm working on the changed behavior part. I've asked Commander Voss to assign me to unconscious bias training. I've also requested that I be removed from first-line evaluation of SEAL candidates for the next 6 months, until I can demonstrate I've actually learned something from this. Kozak turned to look at him for the first time, her eyes searching his face for something. Sincerity, maybe, or maybe just evidence that he understood how badly he'd missed the mark. Why? She asked. Why do any of that? You could just let it slide, move on, pretend it never happened. Because I have a daughter, Hendricks said quietly. She's 7, smart as hell, wants to be an astronaut. And someday, maybe 20 years from now, she's going to walk into a room and some version of me is going to look at her and make an assumption based on nothing but his own limited perspective. And I need to believe that person will be better than I was. That starts with me being better now. The silence that followed was different than before, less uncomfortable, more like the quiet between people who'd reached an understanding, however tentative. Kozak raised her beer in a small salute. To changed behavior, then, and daughters who become astronauts. Hendricks clinked his bottle against hers. To operators who remind us why we're supposed to be better. 3 months later, Kozak was in Afghanistan, attached to a SEAL team conducting operations in the Korangal Valley. The mission was straightforward on paper. Locate and extract a downed pilot who'd ejected from an F-16 after taking ground fire over Taliban-controlled territory. The pilot was alive, was moving, but was 12 miles inside hostile territory with limited supplies and no extraction route. Team commander, a weathered lieutenant commander named Tors, briefed his squad with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this 100 times before. But when he detailed the terrain, the enemy disposition, and the narrow window for extraction, even Tors looked concerned. The valley was a maze of steep ridges and concealed fighting positions, perfect ambush country, the kind of place where conventional operations went to die. We'll insert via helicopter at dusk, Tors explained, pointing to the map. Follow this ridge line northwest, locate the pilot, and be at the extraction point by dawn. Question is how to move 12 miles through hostile territory without alerting every Taliban fighter in the province. Kozak, sitting at the back of the briefing room with the same isolation she'd experienced at Coronado, studied the map with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. She saw the terrain Tors was describing, could visualize the route, the exposure points, the places where the mission could go sideways. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the tactical discussion. What if we don't hide? Every head turned. Tors frowned. Explain. Taliban fighters in the valley are used to watching for concealment tactics. Night movement, small teams trying to slip past their observation posts. They're looking for stealth. So we do the opposite. We move like we own the valley. Fast, loud if necessary, with confidence that suggests we have support they can't see. We make them think twice about engaging. The silence that followed was skeptical. Then Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, Tor's second-in-command, laughed once. That's insane, that's also kind of brilliant. We'd be inside their decision loop the entire time, moving too fast for them to organize a response. Tor studied Kazak with new interest. You're the pilot from Coronado, the one who ran Hendrix's evaluation. That's me. Heard about that, heard you did things that aren't supposed to work. Tor's smile was brief. All right, Lieutenant. We'll try it your way, but if this goes sideways, you're buying drinks for the whole team. Kazak's answering smile matched his. If this goes sideways, we'll probably be too dead to worry about bar tabs. They launched at dusk, the helicopter insertion going smoothly, the team hitting the ground in the valley with the practiced efficiency of operators who'd done this too many times to count. And then they started moving and something remarkable happened. They didn't sneak. They patrolled. Walked like they owned every inch of ground, their weapons ready but not raised, their spacing professional but not paranoid. They looked like a unit that had air support on call, artillery dialed in, quick reaction forces standing by. They looked like engaging them would be the last mistake a Taliban fighter ever made. And the Taliban, watching from their concealed positions, saw that confidence and hesitated. The downed pilot was a 26-year-old captain named Rebecca Marsh, call sign Hammer, who'd spent 18 hours evading capture with a broken leg and diminishing hope. When Kazak emerged from the darkness, when she knelt beside Marsh and said quietly, "We're going home now, Captain," Marsh's expression moved through disbelief, relief, and finally recognition. "Wait, Razor, Vera Kazak, from the 111th, Kazak smiled, beginning her medical assessment with practiced efficiency. "Small world. Looks like you bent the landing a bit, Hammer. How's the pain?" "Better now that you're here." Marsh's voice was tight but controlled. "I heard you went over to Special Operations. Figured they'd eat you alive." "They tried, didn't take." Kazak applied a field splint to Marsh's leg while Tor's team established a security perimeter, their movements quiet now, professional. "Think you can move with support? For you, I'll sprint." The extraction route should have been a nightmare. 12 miles through hostile territory with an injured pilot, moving through terrain that favored defenders at every turn. But Kazak's confidence tactic held. The team moved fast, moved like they were daring someone to engage, and the Taliban fighters who watched them pass did exactly what anyone would do when confronted with an opponent who seemed utterly convinced of their own superiority. They let them go. Tors would later write in his after-action report that it was one of the cleanest extractions he'd ever conducted, that Kazak's unorthodox approach had shaved hours off their timeline and likely prevented multiple engagements. What he didn't include in the official report was what he said to Kazak as they boarded the extraction helicopter at dawn. "That shouldn't have worked. That violated every principle of tactical movement we teach." Kazak, helping Marsh settle into a seat, glanced back at him with the faint smile he was beginning to recognize. "Principles are good, Commander, but sometimes the best tactic is to make the enemy think you know something they don't, even if you're making it up as you go." The success in the Korangal Valley rippled through the special operations community in the way that all good stories do. Quietly at first, then with gathering momentum as more people heard the details. Kazak's name started appearing in tactical discussions, in planning sessions for complex operations, in the kind of conversations that happened between experienced operators trying to solve impossible problems. She was still an outsider in many ways, still the former pilot who'd crossed into a world that didn't always welcome outsiders. But now when she walked into briefing rooms, the silence that greeted her was different. Respectful, attentive, waiting to hear what she'd suggest. Hendrix heard about the Korangal operation from Volkov, who'd heard it from a Navy SEAL he'd served with in Iraq, who'd heard it directly from Tors. The details were impressive, but what struck Hendrix most was the way Tors described Kazak's performance. She has this way of looking at tactical situations like she's seeing 3 moves ahead. Not just what we need to do, but what the enemy will think we're doing, and how we can use that perception against them. It's like playing chess against someone who's simultaneously playing a different game you don't even know exists. Hendricks thought about that description for a long time, sitting in his office at Camp Pendleton, staring at the evaluation reports from Kazak's desert course. He'd spent his entire career learning to be predictable in the best sense, reliably excellent, methodically thorough, textbook perfect in execution. Kazak was none of those things. She was improvisational, unconventional, willing to rewrite the rules mid-operation if the situation demanded it. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. He pulled up his email and started typing before he could talk himself out of it. Lieutenant Kazak, this is Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks from your SEAL evaluation. I wanted to reach out because I'm teaching an advanced tactics course next month at Coronado, and I'd like to invite you to present a session on unconventional problem solving. If you're willing. If you're not, I understand completely. But I think my students need to hear from someone who does things differently. Someone who proves that different can be better. Respectfully, Marcus Hendricks. He sent it before he could reconsider, then sat back and waited for either a reply or the silence that would be its own answer. Kazak's response came 3 days later. Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks, I'll do your presentation on 2 conditions. First, you call me Razor. Second, you attend the session yourself and participate like any other student. If we're going to talk about unconventional thinking, we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions in real time. That includes both of us. Deal, Vera. Hendricks read the email twice, then replied with a single word. Deal. The presentation took place on a Wednesday afternoon in Coronado, in the same briefing room where Hendricks had first delivered his casual cruelty. Kazak stood at the front, dressed in utilities, her hands empty of notes or slides. 20 SEAL candidates and instructors sat waiting, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. I'm not here to teach you tactics, Kazak began, her voice carrying easily through the room. You already know tactics. You've spent months or years learning how to clear buildings, conduct reconnaissance, execute ambushes. What I'm here to talk about is the moment when the tactics don't work, when the situation you're in doesn't match the manual you've memorized, when you have to decide whether to follow the playbook or write a new page. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her showed a photograph of her FA-18 Super Hornet, the one she'd been flying when she was shot down over Syria. This is tale number 603. I flew her for 2 years, conducted 37 combat missions, put ordnance on target with better than 95% accuracy. I was good at my job, very good, but being good at following procedures didn't help me when an enemy MANPADS turned my port engine into scrap metal, and I had to eject over hostile territory. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the quiet intensity in Kazak's voice. She advanced the slide to show a map of Syria, a red circle marking where she'd gone down. I spent 6 days behind enemy lines. No support, no extraction, just me and the survival kit that deployed with my ejection seat. The manual says you should establish a hide site, minimize movement, and wait for rescue. But I was 140 miles inside hostile territory, and waiting meant capture or death. So I moved. I navigated using a compass I made from a needle and a bowl of water. I stole a uniform from a dead Syrian soldier and walked through 2 checkpoints like I belonged there. I provided first aid to a child even though it exposed my position, because some things matter more than personal survival. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. What I learned in those 6 days is that expertise in conventional operations creates blind spots. We become so good at doing things the right way that we forget there are other ways. Ways that might be better for specific situations, even if they violate everything we've been taught. Hendricks, sitting in the back row, found himself nodding involuntarily. This was what he'd missed during the evaluation. Not Kazak's capability, but the philosophy that drove her decisions. The understanding that rules were tools, not laws. That sometimes the greatest skill was knowing when to set the manual aside. Kazak continued. During my SEAL evaluation, Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks designed scenarios that were supposed to test my ability to function under pressure. What they actually tested was my willingness to reject his assumptions about how problems should be solved. When I used smoke grenades to approach an elevated position in daylight, when I called in artillery on a medical scenario, when I set fire to half a mock city rather than clear it room by room, those weren't tactics I learned in a classroom. They were decisions I made because the situation demanded them. She looked directly at Hendricks when she said this, her expression neutral but her meaning clear. This wasn't criticism. It was acknowledgement. So here's what I want you to take away from this session. Your training is essential. Your skills are hard-won and valuable. But the moment you believe your training has all the answers is the moment you become predictable. And in our line of work, predictable means dead. The discussion that followed went 90 minutes over schedule, candidates and instructors alike peppering Kazak with questions that ranged from technical to philosophical. How do you know when to deviate from doctrine? How do you maintain unit cohesion when you're doing things that make no tactical sense to everyone else? How do you live with the risk of making unconventional decisions that might get people killed? Kazak answered each question with the same careful honesty, never claiming to have perfect solutions, always emphasizing that unconventional thinking wasn't about being reckless. It was about expanding the menu of possible responses. The goal isn't to reject training, she said near the end. The goal is to hold your training lightly enough that you can modify it when circumstances demand, to see the principles underneath the procedures, and to apply those principles creatively. When the session finally ended, when the last candidate had asked their final question and filed out with expressions suggesting they had a lot to think about, Hendricks approached the front of the room where Kazak was packing up her materials. That was not what I expected, he said. What were you expecting? Honestly, I thought you'd spend 90 minutes proving how wrong I was during your evaluation. Kazak's smile was brief but genuine. You were wrong, Gunnery Sergeant. We both know that. But talking about it wouldn't change anything. Better to talk about why you were wrong, about the assumptions we all carry that limit what we think is possible. Hendricks felt something shift in his chest, a realignment of perspective that was uncomfortable but necessary. For what it's worth, I learned more from you today than I've learned from the last 5 instructors I've studied under, and I'm sorry it took me so long to be willing to learn. Apology accepted, on one condition. What's that? Next time you design an evaluation for someone who doesn't fit your expectations, you start by questioning your expectations instead of the person. Hendricks extended his hand. Deal. They shook, and in that moment something resolved that had been broken since that first briefing room encounter. Not friendship, exactly, but mutual respect. Recognition that they were both on the same team, trying to make each other better, even when the process was uncomfortable. 6 months later, Kazak was leading her own SEAL team on operations in the Philippines, conducting counterterrorism operations against Abu Sayyaf elements in the southern islands. Her team was a mix of experienced operators and newer SEALs, all of whom had requested assignment with her after hearing the stories, after seeing her present at Coronado, after deciding they wanted to learn from someone who thought differently. Staff Sergeant Nicole Reeves was among them. She'd put in for transfer immediately after Kazak's presentation, had written in her request that she wanted to learn from operators who challenged conventional wisdom. Torres approved the transfer personally, telling Reeves quietly that working with Kazak would either make her a better operator or drive her crazy, possibly both. The operation in Mindanao was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Identify Abu Sayyaf positions, collect intelligence, report back for larger follow-on operations. Standard stuff. But when Kazak's team reached the target area, they found something unexpected. A village that Abu Sayyaf had occupied, using civilians as human shields, making any direct military action unthinkable. The conventional response would have been to fall back, request guidance, wait for higher authority to make the difficult decisions about proportional force and acceptable collateral damage. Instead, Kazakh spent 3 hours sitting on a hillside overlooking the village, studying the patterns of movement, the ebb and flow of civilian activity versus hostile presence. Then she stood up and announced to her team, "We're going to negotiate." Reeves blinked. "Ma'am, we're not authorized for negotiations. That's way above our pay grade." "I know, which is why we're not going to ask permission. We're going to walk down there, talk to the Abu Sayyaf commander, and offer him a choice. He lets the civilians go, we let him withdraw without engagement. He refuses, we make his life very difficult." The plan was insane. It violated doctrine, exceeded their authority, and created risks that made everyone uncomfortable. But as Kazakh explained her reasoning, as she detailed how the unconventional approach created opportunities that conventional tactics couldn't, the team began to understand. Not necessarily agree, but understand. "You're asking us to trust that you know what you're doing," said Petty Officer First Class James Chen, who transferred from Hendrix's Marine unit to work with SEALs specifically because of what he'd learned during Kazakh's evaluation. Kazakh met his eyes steadily. "I'm asking you to trust that sometimes the best military solution isn't military at all. That sometimes winning means finding an outcome where everyone walks away. But if you're not comfortable with this, speak now. I won't order anyone into a situation they fundamentally disagree with." Nobody spoke. They'd all signed up for this, for working with someone who did things differently. Time to find out what that actually meant. The negotiation took place in the village center, with Kazakh walking into Abu Sayyaf territory under a white flag improvised from a t-shirt, her team positioned on the hillside as overwatch, but with orders not to engage unless she was fired upon. The Abu Sayyaf commander, a weathered fighter in his 40s named Malik, met her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "You're American military," he said in accented English. "Why would I negotiate with you? Because I'm offering you something you won't get otherwise, a chance to walk away." Kazakh kept her hands visible, her weapon slung, her entire posture communicating that she was here to talk, not fight. "You're using these villagers as shields because you know we won't risk civilian casualties. Smart tactic, but it only works until it doesn't. Until we decide the risk is worth it, or until we find a way to separate you from your shields. Or you can accept my offer, release the civilians, withdraw to positions of your choosing, and we don't engage. You live to fight another day. The villagers go home. Everyone wins except the people who want this to turn into a bloodbath." Malik studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, "Why would you offer this? Your country kills people like me with drones, sends special forces teams to eliminate targets. Why negotiate? Because I've seen enough violence to know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose not to fight. Because these villagers didn't choose to be part of this conflict, and they deserve better than becoming casualties of our decision-making." Kazakh's voice was steady, without judgment or hostility. "And because I think you're smart enough to recognize that this is a better outcome than the alternatives. Take the win, Malik. Let these people go home." The silence that followed felt like held breath. Then Malik nodded once slowly and began issuing orders in rapid Tagalog. Within 30 minutes, the villagers were released, streaming out of the village toward safety. Within an hour, Abu Sayyaf fighters had withdrawn into the jungle, disappearing like smoke. Kazakh's team provided security until every civilian was clear, then withdrew themselves, heading back to base with 0 shots fired and 0 casualties. The after-action report created a minor firestorm back at headquarters. Kazakh had exceeded her authority, conducted negotiations without approval, made promises she wasn't technically empowered to make. But she'd also achieved an outcome that would have required days of planning and significant risk to accomplish through conventional means. And she'd done it without firing a single shot, without risking her team, without creating new grievances that would fuel future conflicts. The commanding officer who debriefed Kazakh was a captain named Sarah Mitchell, a veteran of multiple special operations deployments who'd seen enough to recognize effectiveness when it didn't come in regulation packaging. "Lieutenant, what you did was either brilliant or career-ending, possibly both. Help me understand why you thought this was a good idea." Kazakh, sitting in the same position of attention she'd maintained throughout the debrief, answered without hesitation. "Ma'am, I thought it was a good idea because the alternative was either letting Abu Sayyaf continue using civilians as shields or conducting an operation that would have resulted in civilian casualties we could avoid. Neither of those outcomes served our strategic interests or our values, so I created a third option: exceeding your authority and conducting unauthorized negotiations with terrorists, by using the tools available to me to achieve the mission objective with minimal risk and maximum effectiveness." "Yes, ma'am." Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying Kazak with an expression that gave nothing away. "You realize this kind of independent action could get you court-martialed?" "I do, ma'am. I also realize it worked, and that the villagers who went home safely tonight don't care about my authorization level. They care that they're alive." The silence stretched. Then Mitchell's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "Off the record, Lieutenant, I think what you did was exactly right. On the record, I'm required to document this as an unauthorized deviation from mission parameters and recommend you receive additional guidance on operational authority limits." "Understood." "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now get out of my office before I have to think too hard about the precedent we're setting here." Kazak stood, saluted, and left, finding Reeves waiting in the hallway outside. The former Marine looked tense, as if she'd been preparing herself for the worst. Well, Kazak said, "apparently I need additional guidance on operational authority limits, which means I'm not being court-martialed, just documented. Could be worse." Reeves let out a breath she'd been holding. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? When we were on that hillside, when you decided to walk into that village, were you scared?" Kazak stopped walking, turned to face Reeves fully. "Terrified, every single step, but being scared of doing something dangerous doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means you need to be careful and thoughtful about how you approach it. Fear is information, not a stop sign." Reeves nodded slowly, filing this away with all the other lessons she was learning from working with someone who operated outside the normal boundaries. "Thank you, ma'am, for trusting us with this. Thank you for being willing to follow someone who doesn't always color inside the lines." The story of the Mindanao negotiation reached Coronado eventually, as all good special operations stories do. Hendricks heard it from 3 different sources before he finally sent Kazak an email. "Heard you negotiated with terrorists instead of shooting them. Very on brand for you. Also heard it worked perfectly. When you get back stateside, drinks are on me. You keep making me reconsider everything I thought I knew about this job. Marcus." Kazak's reply came a week later. "Negotiation is just another tactical option. Sometimes the best weapon is the one you don't fire. Looking forward to those drinks. We have a lot to talk about. Vera." They met 6 weeks later at the same Coronado bar where Hendricks had first approached her to apologize, the sunset painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. This time there was no awkwardness, no uncomfortable searching for words. They sat and ordered beers and fell into the kind of conversation that happens between operators who have earned each other's respect through difficult lessons. "I've been thinking about our evaluation," Hendricks said after they'd been talking for a while. "About what I was really testing for. I think I was looking for someone who could do what I do just as well as I could do it, instead of looking for someone who could do things I couldn't even imagine." "That's not unusual," Kazak said. "We all tend to measure competence by how closely someone mirrors our own capabilities. It takes conscious effort to recognize that different can be equally effective, or even superior. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's necessary, especially in special operations, where we're constantly facing novel problems that our existing playbooks don't fully address." She paused, watching the sunset. "I got shot down over Syria because I was following doctrine. Flying a prescribed route at a prescribed altitude at a prescribed time. The enemy knew the doctrine too, so they knew exactly where to position their MANPADS. I survived the next 6 days by rejecting every piece of doctrine I'd learned, because survival required thinking like someone who'd never read the manual." Hendricks absorbed this quietly. "Is that what drives you now? The memory of being shot down? Partially, but also just. I've seen what happens when we get too comfortable with our procedures. We stop seeing opportunities. Stop recognizing when the situation demands flexibility. I don't want to be that operator. Don't want to lead teams that operate that way. I'd rather be the person who makes everyone uncomfortable by asking whether we're doing things this way because they work or because they're familiar. You're definitely that person, Hendricks said with a slight smile. And for what it's worth, I think the special operations community is better for having you in it, even when you make us uncomfortable, especially then. 2 years after the Coronado evaluation that had started everything, Kazak found herself back in a briefing room as the sun rose over Naval Amphibious Base. But this time, she was the one standing at the front, and the SEAL candidates filling the seats were looking at her with expressions she recognized. A mix of nervousness, determination, and the fierce hope that they'd prove themselves worthy. Commander Voss, now a captain and still running SEAL training, stood beside her as the candidates settled. "Listen up," Voss began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades earning respect the hard way. "Lieutenant Commander Kazak, that's right, she made 04 last month, is here to oversee your final evaluation. Some of you have heard the stories. Some of you know what she did during her own evaluation, what she's done since. The rest of you are about to learn." Kazak stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room, seeing in these candidates' faces echoes of her own journey. "This evaluation will test your tactical skills, your physical endurance, your ability to function under pressure. But more than that, it will test your willingness to think beyond what you've been taught, to recognize that the manual is a starting point, not a destination." She paused, letting her next words carry weight. "Some of you will do everything by the book and succeed. That's fine. We need operators who can execute doctrine perfectly. But some of you will find yourselves in situations where the book doesn't have answers, where you'll need to write your own page. That's fine too. We need both kinds of operators." One of the candidates, a young woman sitting in the front row with the same isolated position Kazak had occupied 2 years ago, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you know which kind you are?" Kazak smiled, recognizing something of herself in this candidate. "You don't, not really. You just keep showing up, keep learning, keep pushing yourself to be better than you were yesterday. And sometimes, when everything goes wrong and the manual doesn't help, you discover capabilities you didn't know you had. That's when you find out." The evaluation that followed was comprehensive and brutal, incorporating everything Kazak had learned from her own experience and from the operations she'd conducted since. She tested the candidates' tactical skills, yes, but also their creativity, their willingness to challenge assumptions, their ability to adapt when plans fell apart. She put them in situations with no clear right answer and watched how they reasoned through the ambiguity. She created scenarios where following doctrine would fail and rewarded those who recognized the limitations of conventional approaches. And throughout it all, she watched that young woman from the front row, saw her struggle and adapt and ultimately succeed by finding approaches that weren't in any manual. When the evaluation concluded 5 days later, when the successful candidates stood exhausted and proud while Voss congratulated them, Kazak approached the young woman. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Sophia Ramos, ma'am, call sign Phoenix." "Why Phoenix?" "Because I've had to rebuild myself more than once, keep rising from failures." Kazak nodded, seeing in Ramos echoes of her own path. "You did well this week, especially in the urban warfare scenario. That flanking maneuver through the drainage system was creative." "Thank you, ma'am. I learned from your Coronado evaluation footage. Commander Voss made us study it." "What did you learn?" Ramos considered the question carefully. "That sometimes the best path forward is the one nobody expects you to take. That confidence can be a weapon, that the manual is a tool, not a religion. Good lessons. Remember them when things get hard, when people doubt you because you don't fit their expectations, when you find yourself in situations where nothing you've learned seems to apply." Kazak paused, then added, "And remember that different isn't wrong. It's just different. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed." The sun had set over Coronado, painting the base in shades of purple and gold, when Kazak finally made it back to her office. She found an email waiting from Gunnery Sergeant Hendricks. now promoted to Master Sergeant and teaching advanced tactics at the Marine Corps training facility in Quantico. Vera, heard you just finished running the SEAL evaluation. Heard you were fair but challenging, pushed candidates to think beyond doctrine, and that the woman who finished first used tactics she learned from studying your evaluation. Heard she's being compared to you already. How does it feel to become the thing that scares instructors? Marcus, Kazak smiled and typed her reply. Marcus, it feels like progress. Like maybe we're finally learning that excellence comes in many forms. Like maybe the next generation won't have to fight as hard as we did to prove they deserve to be here. That's worth every uncomfortable conversation, every challenge to authority, every time we had to prove the conventional wisdom was incomplete. We're making it easier for those who come after. That's the job. Vera, she sent the email, then sat back in her chair, looking at the photographs on her wall. Her Super Hornet, tail number 603, before it went down over Syria. Her SEAL team from the Philippines operation, gathered around the village they'd liberated through negotiation instead of violence. A group photo from her own evaluation, with Hendricks and his Marines, taken 6 months after the fact when they'd finally reached a place where they could laugh about the whole experience. And newest of all, a photo from yesterday's graduation, with Ramos and the other successful candidates, their faces showing the exhaustion and pride that came from proving themselves against impossible standards. Kazak studied that last photograph, seeing in those faces the future of special operations. A future where maybe, just maybe, diversity of thought would be recognized as the tactical advantage it was. Where operators would be judged by their effectiveness rather than their adherence to expectations. Where different would be valued instead of merely tolerated. The journey from that first briefing room, where Hendricks had told her not to cry, to this moment, overseeing the evaluation of the next generation, had been longer and harder than she'd anticipated. But it had also been necessary. Every challenge, every time she'd proven that unconventional approaches could work, every operator she'd trained to think beyond the manual, all of it mattered. All of it contributed to slowly, steadily changing the culture of special operations. She thought about the young woman she'd been, ejecting over Syria, spending 6 days evading capture, learning through pure necessity that survival required rejecting comfort and embracing uncertainty. That version of herself would be proud of who she'd become. Would be proud that the lessons learned in those 6 days had been passed on, had been formalized, had been incorporated into training that would help others survive their own moments of crisis. And she thought about the version of herself who'd walked into that briefing room 2 years ago, who'd absorbed Hendrix's cruelty without flinching, who'd proven through 5 days of impossible scenarios that competence transcends expectations. That version of herself would be proud too. Would recognize that the journey had been worth it, that the discomfort had created space for growth, that sometimes the hardest fights are the ones that matter most. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Reeves, who was currently deployed somewhere Kazak wasn't cleared to know. Ma'am, just successfully completed an op using negotiation tactics adapted from Mindanao. 0 casualties, full objective completion. This approach is spreading. You're creating a legacy. Kazak stared at that last sentence for a long moment. Legacy. She'd never thought of her career in those terms, had never imagined that her unconventional approaches would become something others studied and adapted. She'd just been trying to survive, to succeed, to prove that different could be effective. But somehow, without intending it, she'd become a reference point, a case study, an example of what was possible when you refused to accept that the existing playbook had all the answers. She typed her response. It's not my legacy, Nicole. It's ours. Every operator who's willing to think differently, who's willing to challenge assumptions, who's willing to risk being wrong in pursuit of being better, they're all creating this together. I just happen to go first. Keep doing good work. Keep making me proud. She sent the message, then stood and walked to the window, looking out over Coronado as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere out there, SEAL candidates were preparing for their own evaluations, their own moments of truth. Somewhere, instructors like Hendricks were learning to see past their biases, to recognize excellence in forms they hadn't expected. Somewhere, operators were incorporating unconventional tactics into their planning, expanding the definition of what was possible. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between missions and training and the endless work of becoming better, the culture was changing. Slowly, incrementally, but undeniably. Lieutenant Commander Vera Razor Kazak, former fighter pilot, SEAL operator, and reluctant revolutionary, allowed herself a small smile. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments when she'd need to prove that different didn't mean inferior, more times when the manual wouldn't have answers and she'd need to write new pages. But she was ready. She'd always been ready. The only difference was that now, finally, people were starting to listen. The stars emerged one by one overhead, ancient light traveling impossible distances to reach this moment, this place. This woman who'd learned to navigate by improvised compass and determination alone. She'd started as someone they mocked. She'd become someone they respected. And someday, if she did this right, she'd become someone who was simply remembered for doing the work, without qualification or surprise. Just Razor. Just an operator who served with honor, led with integrity, and proved through action that excellence transcends expectation. That future felt close now. Closer than it had any right to be. Close enough to believe in. She turned from the window and headed home, leaving the office lights burning behind her, a beacon in the darkness for all those who would follow.